Elvis was the king. Everyone knows that. But even a king sometimes has to do things he really doesn't want to do. Sometimes that meant singing a song that felt utterly wrong. A song that just wasn't him. A song that felt cheap, maybe even a little silly, like the one you're thinking about. The one that felt like it was pulling his strings, making him dance to someone else's tune. It's easy to look back now and wonder, how could Elvis, the iconic, rebellious, hip-shaking rock and roll legend, end up performing something that sounds so? Not just one song, but a whole string of them, especially during a certain period of his life. To understand why Elvis might have been forced to sing any song he didn't like, we have to go back. Way back, before he was the king of rock and roll, he was just a kid from Tupelo, Mississippi, with a guitar and a dream. He loved music, all kinds of music. Blues, gospel, country. He poured his soul into every note. When he first broke big, he had a lot of control. He picked his songs, he shaped his sound. That raw energy, that freedom, that's what made him famous, that's what made him Elvis. But fame, especially that kind of blinding, all-encompassing fame, comes with a price. And for Elvis, a big part of that price was his creative freedom. It didn't happen overnight, but slowly, surely, the strings started to appear. The first big turning point, maybe, was the Army. When Elvis went into the service in 1958, he left a world he understood. He came back 2 years later to a different music scene. Rock and roll was still there, but things were shifting. And more importantly, the person managing his career, Colonel Tom Parker, had spent those 2 years cementing his control. Parker was a genius at promotion. He was a master at making money, but he wasn't really interested in artistic integrity. He was interested in the brand, in the legend, and in the cash registers ringing. When Elvis got back from the Army, Parker had a plan. A big plan. It involved Hollywood. Lots and lots of movies. This was supposed to be the next logical step for a star of Elvis's magnitude. Frank Sinatra did it. Dean Martin did it. Why not Elvis? And so, the movie era began. At first, it wasn't so bad. Movies like G Blues or Blue Hawaii were big hits. They showed Elvis in exotic locations, singing catchy tunes. People loved them. And they made a lot of money. Which, for Parker, was the main thing. But the machine, once it started, became relentless. And Elvis made almost 30 movies in the 1960s. Think about that. That's nearly 2 to 3 movies a year, year after year. Well, it was an assembly line. And on an assembly line, creativity often takes a backseat to efficiency. The movie plots became repetitive. Boy meets girl, sings a few songs, solves a problem, happy ending. The scripts got thinner. The acting often felt phoned in. And the songs. The songs. This is where your question really hits home. Because with each movie came a soundtrack. And these soundtracks weren't always filled with the soulful, rebellious rock and roll that had made Elvis famous. Oh no. These were movie songs. Often they were written by staff songwriters hired by the studios. They were designed to fit the movie's light, often comedic, plot. They were meant to be pleasant, unobtrusive, and quickly forgotten. They were, in short, often incredibly cheesy. Elvis hated a lot of them. He really did. Stories from people who worked with him, from the Memphis Mafia, his close friends and entourage, all tell the same tale. Elvis would sit in the recording studio, often with a look of resignation, sometimes even despair as he ran through these tunes. He'd complain, he'd grumble, he'd ask if there wasn't something better. But the answer, almost always, was no. Why no? Because of the contracts. Colonel Parker was a master negotiator. He'd sign Elvis up for these movies, often with very little creative input for Elvis himself. The deals were airtight. The studios dictated the scripts, the directors, and crucially, the music. And Elvis was obligated. He had to show up, he had to sing the songs, it was part of the deal. His name was on the dotted line. And it wasn't just the movie songs. Even for his regular studio albums, away from the movie sets, Parker would often push for certain kinds of material. He wanted hits. He wanted songs that would appeal to the broadest possible audience. And sometimes that meant songs that were safe, middle of the road, and again, quite often, cheesy. Elvis might have wanted to record more blues, more gospel, more raw rock and roll. But Parker would steer him towards what he thought would sell. Think about the sheer volume of music Elvis recorded during this time. Hundreds of songs. Many of them were good, even great, but mixed in there were dozens and dozens of songs that felt like filler. Songs that felt beneath his talent, songs that were simply there to fulfill a contract, to fill out a movie soundtrack album. The kind of song that, let's be honest, might have sounded like the one you mentioned. It's hard to imagine being Elvis, having all that power, all that fame, and yet feeling so powerless in your own career. He was trapped in a golden cage. The money was astronomical. He lived a life of luxury. He bought houses, cars, gifts for everyone he knew. But that lifestyle, too, created its own chains. He needed the money to maintain it, he needed the movies, the albums, the appearances. And Parker was the one who controlled the purse strings, the schedules, the whole machinery. Because Elvis knew he was a star. He knew his voice was incredible. He knew he could do more. He watched other artists like the Beatles and Bob Dylan take more control of their careers, write their own songs, experiment with new sounds. And he felt stuck. He felt like a commodity, like a product, not an artist. There's a famous story about Elvis trying to record a serious dramatic movie. He wanted to be a real actor, like Marlon Brando. He did King Creole, which was a great film. But Parker and the studios preferred the lighter fare. The musicals, they were easier to make. They were guaranteed money makers. They didn't challenge anyone too much, and they required those specific kinds of songs. The easy-listening, pop-oriented, often saccharine tunes that would make people tap their feet gently, not really think too hard, and definitely not rock too hard. As Elvis became disillusioned, he gained weight, he became more withdrawn. The joy of making music, of performing, started to fade for long stretches. He still had moments of brilliance, of course. His passion for gospel music never left him. He'd often finish a grueling movie recording session by going into another studio and just singing gospel with his friends for hours, just for the pure love of it. That was his escape. That was where he felt free. But then it was back to the grind. Back to the next movie. Back to the next soundtrack. Back to the songs he didn't want to sing. He would go through the motions, he would put his professional face on, he would deliver the performance, because he was Elvis. And even when he hated a song, he usually managed to make it sound better than it had any right to be. He had that magic, that incredible, undeniable charisma. Even with the silliest material, a little bit of Elvis would shine through. A smirk, a glance, a slight hip sway. Just enough to remind you that the king was still in there. Somewhere, even if he was on autopilot. The creative dry spell lasted for years, through most of the 1960s. It was a frustrating time for him, and for many of his fans who wished he'd get back to his roots. The music was becoming almost irrelevant. It was background noise for light comedies. It was packaged. It was safe. And yes, it was often cheesy. It wasn't until the famous '68 comeback special that Elvis truly broke free, even if only for a little while. That special allowed him to be himself again, to perform live, raw, and full of energy. To sing the songs he wanted to sing. It was a revelation. It reminded everyone, including Elvis himself, of what he was truly capable of. It was him cutting some of those strings, even after the comeback, even after he started performing live again in Las Vegas and touring, the shadow of past obligations and the influence of Parker still lingered. He still had to balance his artistic desires with the commercial realities. He still faced pressure to record certain types of songs to maintain a certain image. But he had more say. He had fought back. So, when you ask why Elvis might have been forced to sing a song he found incredibly cheesy, like the one you mentioned, you're touching on a very real and painful truth about his career. He was often a prisoner of his own fame, of his contracts, of his manager's relentless pursuit of money, and of Hollywood's insatiable machine. He was Elvis Presley, the biggest star in the world, and yet in many ways he was indeed a kind of puppet. He had to perform even when the material didn't align with his heart or his soul. He did it for the money, for the contracts, for the fans, and because, ultimately, it was his job. It was his life. Now, about that specific song you asked about, the one with the catchy, slightly bouncy tune, where the singer talks about, being controlled, being led around like a doll. It's interesting that you picked that one because it really does perfectly capture the feeling of what Elvis went through with a lot of his material. The lyrics themselves, the idea of being a puppet on a string, are almost a direct metaphor for his situation during the movie years. But the truth is, while Elvis certainly felt that way about many songs he was forced to perform, and while he did sing a vast number of movie songs that were, shall we say, less than rock and roll, he never actually recorded or performed Puppet on a String. That particular hit song was sung by Sandy Shaw, and it won the Eurovision Song Contest for the UK in 1967. But your question really gets to the heart of something very true about Elvis. He was often made to sing songs he hated, songs that felt like they were pulling his strings. And in that sense, even if he didn't sing that specific song, the sentiment behind your question is absolutely spot on.